Hello, my name is Tyler Williams, and alongside me is Lucas Hoffman and Adam Minnick. Today we'll be discussing a system that models temperature change of extruded PETG 3D printer filament.
The purpose of this experiment was to measure the temperature of extruded 3D printer filament at various lengths from the extruder tip. We made sure to collect enough data to ensure we could properly analyze the data without missing anything. This data was then used to create a first-order transfer function to calculate a time constant. From this, we could determine the speed of the fan through a simplified electrical system.
This material has been chosen due to the fact that many clear plastic bottles use PETE, a cheap variation of polyethylene terephthalate. It is the goal of Trimatis LLC to produce 3D printer filament using 100% recycled Type 1 plastic, PETE. PETG is a variation of PETE with a glycol additive, which was chosen due to the added benefit of high weather resistance. Once the extrusion parameters have been determined for 100% PETG, post-consumer plastic PETE will be gradually introduced to the hopper. This desktop extruder employs an adjustable speed motor which rotates a screw at a constant speed. A gravity-fed hopper feeds the PETG pellets into open flights on the screw. The screw rotates through a heated barrel towards a heated 2 mm nozzle. The temperature of the barrel and nozzle can be adjusted in increments of 1 degree Celsius. Once the material has been pushed through the nozzle, a small fan cools the filament to solidification. This device applies tension to the filament after it comes out of the nozzle, measures the solidified diameter, and spools the filament. A dial is available to control the angular velocity of the spooler as well as the linear velocity of the transverse arm. The second dial allows for a wide spool to be wound while preventing the filament from tangling. The data of interest is the temperature of the filament as it travels away from the nozzle. Since this filament must remain cylindrical and is at 240 degrees Celsius when it leaves the nozzle, it is important to determine the surface temperature without contacting the material. This infrared thermometer allows non-contact temperature measurements to be made within an accuracy of 2% of the overall reading. PETG is a hygroscopic material, which means it absorbs moisture from the humidity in the environment. Since the pellets are not being stored in a vacuum-sealed container and the Berks environment is humid, it is necessary to complete a drying cycle before extrusion. This convection oven is a cheap device that accomplishes this process on a large batch of pellets in just 2 hours.
The following pictures will better explain some of the items we have mentioned. First, the PETG is loaded into the hopper of the extruder. The hopper is kept full throughout the entire experiment to try and keep the diameter of the filament as constant as possible. The pellets are fed through a screw mechanism to push the pellets into a heating element and then out the extruder tip. This is the fan we are referring to. It blows air onto the newly extruded filament for rapid cooling. The effectiveness of this fan will be discussed in the following slides. Finally, once the filament has solidified, the diameter is measured and spooled up to be used in a 3D printer.
The data collection process for this experiment was relatively simple. We used an infrared laser thermometer to measure the temperature of the filament at various lengths along the extruded filament. These distances were measured across the back of the wall, and we tried to aim the laser of the temperature probe at each of the lines to the semi-transparent filament for accurate readings at known distances from the extruder tip. Once we got far enough away from the extruder tip to notice a steady state value, we stopped the data collection process. We recorded the display of the thermometer using a tablet and later documented the measured data in Excel. Because the temperature fluctuated so much, we recorded a temperature every second of the video to ensure a high amount of data could be analyzed, and then took the mean, not including the outliers, for analysis.
Throughout the experiment, we had to make some assumptions to simplify our data. First, we had to assume the temperature of the filament only changed with respect to distance after the extruder. While this is true, other factors could have played a role in why the filament cooled as quickly as it did. The next assumption is based on the equipment we had access to. Ideally, the extrusion nozzle was held at a constant 240 degrees Celsius, but from the data collected, we know it varied with time. Once the filament was cooled, we were able to measure the diameter of the filament using the Filament spooler. The diameter of the filament did change during the extrusion process due to varying amounts of PETG being fed into the extruder. To simplify our equations, we determined an acceptable average diameter to be used in calculation. Also, for simplification in the convection calculation, we assumed a constant fan speed. For the same reason, we assumed the room was at a constant temperature. To allow us to use constant material properties, we considered only pure PETG pellets.
The diameter of the extruded PETG filament was held at a constant diameter of 1.5 millimeters. The length at which the filament completely hardened at was located 5 inches away from the extruder nozzle. With the length at the steady state and the diameter known, the volume and area were then calculated to help determine the thermal resistance and the capacitance, using the calculated convection coefficient H, and from the published datasheet values for density ρ, specific heat capacity Cp, conductivity K, the kinematic viscosity for air nu, and the Prandtl number PR. We then determined the equivalent transfer function for the system.
The transfer function was determined using an electrical model with a constant input temperature, modeled as an input voltage EI. There is a thermal resistance to the flow of temperature from the filament to the surrounding air, which is modeled as a resistor. This resistor's physical properties are modeled as 1 over the convection coefficient times the surface area of the filament. Since the filament reaches a steady temperature at 16 degrees Celsius, which is roughly the same as the room temperature, a capacitor is added with an equivalent voltage. This voltage is the output of the transfer function, EO. The physical properties of this capacitor are modeled as ρ v Cp. The transfer function is turned into the standard first-order form of 1 over tau s plus 1. This tau is determined to be ρ v Cp over HA, as shown on this slide.
The system started at the original nozzle temperature of 240 degrees Celsius, and it eventually reached steady state around the room temperature of 16 degrees Celsius. There were some outliers as seen in blue. These values were discarded to better plot the exponential fitted curve. We then found the tau of the system by calculating 63% of the change in temperature. Once the tau was found, the experimental convection coefficient was calculated.
Now that we have the experimental value of the convection coefficient, we use it to calculate the value of the thermal conductivity of PETG, and ultimately use that to determine the speed of the fan. We decided to do this by calculating a range of thermal conductivity values using a range of values we thought were reasonable for the speed of the fan. We then plotted both of those values and found which omega related to the known value of thermal conductivity of 0.29 watts per meter Kelvin. As seen on the plot, the closest value of thermal conductivity was 0.2906, which gave us an omega value of 28 radians per second. From here, we were able to calculate the velocity of the air moving towards the extruded filament, and finally the Reynolds number. The Reynolds number told us the flow of the air around the filament was laminar.
This derivation is continued by calculating the Nusselt number, which when combined with our experimental convection coefficient, conductivity constant, and characteristic length of the filament, resulted in a time constant which matches our experimental value.
With the assumptions that were made, we can estimate the fan speed from the experimental value of tau. This data can then be used as important information for TriMatis and further research of producing industry standard PETE 3D printer filament. We have listed the user manuals and the empirical data for the materials and tools used on the following slide.